It's quite simple. There has to be followers and there got to be leaders. I just choose to be the one.
In the brutal north, power doesn't fade quietly. It's ripped away. For over a decade, one man ruled the Yukon like a king. Tony Beets, the loudest, toughest miner in all of Dawson. His empire ran on diesel, grit, and sheer defiance. But in one shocking week, it all came crashing down. First came the inspection notice, then the ban, and finally, total silence. The king of the Klondike was officially locked out of his own ground. But here's where the story twists. While Tony's empire froze to a standstill, Parker Schnabel was already moving, fast. Within 72 hours, his crew rolled in with trucks, permits, and a plan that would change everything. What looked like a disaster for Tony turned into a golden opportunity for Parker, and a betrayal no one saw coming. Rumors, leaks, secret filings, even whispers of sabotage. Was this an unlucky break or a strategic takedown years in the making? Stay tuned, because what happened next flipped the entire Yukon mining world upside down. Whose side are you on, Tony or Parker? Drop your answer in the comments below. And before we uncover how Parker pulled off his most ruthless move yet, smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this story is just getting started. They say in the Yukon, gold doesn't just test your back, it tests your soul. And if you've been around long enough, you learn one thing real quick. No one strikes it rich alone. Long before the rivalries, the shutdowns, and the scandals, there was a time when Tony Beets and Parker Schnabel stood shoulder to shoulder, not as enemies, but as brothers of the dirt. Parker was still a kid then, barely in his early 20s, full of fire and too much ambition for his own good. He'd already made waves in the gold fields, but back then, he was still learning what it meant to survive in the north. The freezing winds, the busted hoses, the endless mud, it chews up rookies fast. And standing there, larger than life, was Tony Beets, the legend himself. They called him the King of the Klondike. His voice could drown out an excavator, his laugh could shake a bar room, and his work ethic, it was pure iron. Tony had dug gold out of ground others had called worthless, and he did it with nothing but grit, diesel, and a stubborn refusal to quit. When Parker first showed up at Tony's claim, most folks thought the young gun wouldn't last a week. But Tony saw something different. He saw the same hunger he'd once had, that raw determination to carve your name into frozen earth. So instead of brushing him off, Tony took him in. Not as a partner at first, but as a student. That season, the Yukon came alive with their energy. They shared equipment, swapped advice, and moved dirt like men possessed. Tony's massive dredge operation was in full swing, an iron beast chewing through pay dirt by the ton, while Parker's crew ran the smaller but nimble operation just down the creek. The two camps might have looked different, but the mission was the same: find gold, no matter what it takes. Every morning, the valley echoed with the same sounds: diesel engines roaring, gravel slamming against sluice boxes, and the metallic rattle of raw gold hitting pans. The cameras captured it all. Parker glancing at Tony for a nod of approval, Tony grinning that rare grin and saying, "You're learning, kid." Together, they pulled hundreds of ounces of gold from that frozen ground. Their cleanups glowed under the camp lights like molten fire. Some called it luck, others said it was destiny. But for a brief, shining moment, the old king and the young prodigy stood united against the land itself. They laughed, they argued, they cursed the weather, but they respected each other. Tony even loaned Parker one of his spare dozers during a tough season, and when a critical wash plant broke down, Parker's mechanic crew rushed to help Tony's team fix it before the frost set in. In the Yukon, that kind of trust means everything. Viewers watching Gold Rush that season saw something special. Not just two miners chasing pay dirt, but a passing of the torch. One man at the peak of his empire, another on the rise. But behind the laughter and gold weigh-ins, there was something else, an invisible clock ticking in the background. Parker was learning fast, faster than anyone expected, and Tony, a man who'd spent decades clawing gold from the earth, could see it coming. The kid wasn't going to stay in anyone's shadow for long. Still, in that fleeting moment of history, the two of them were unstoppable. Their combined output broke records across the valley, with pay streaks so rich that even the old-timers whispered about it in the bars of Dawson City. Some said it was the beginning of a new gold dynasty, the Beets and Schnabel alliance that would dominate the Yukon for decades. But the Yukon is a strange place. It gives and it takes, and when it takes, it doesn't ask permission. No one knew it then, but the partnership that began with respect and brotherhood was already headed towards something darker. In the cold northern air, pride has a way of freezing over friendship. And soon enough, the same gold that brought them together would tear them apart. They say the Yukon can make a man rich, but it can also make him hard. Out here, the winters freeze deep, and sometimes so do friendships. After that golden season, where Tony Beets and Parker Schnabel struck pay dirt side by side, the whole mining world was buzzing. Together, they'd pulled hundreds of ounces from ground that most folks thought was tapped out. Tony's massive dredge operation thundered across the valley, while Parker's younger, faster crew tore through pay streaks like wildfire. The cameras couldn't get enough of it. The old king and the rising prodigy rewriting the rules of the Klondike. But success has a funny way of changing things. It starts small, like frost creeping over steel. You barely notice it until everything's frozen solid. As Parker's cleanups grew bigger and his gold totals climbed higher, so did his confidence. The young miner who once asked Tony for advice now started trusting his own instincts. He built new wash plants, upgraded his gear, and even began scouting his own leases. For Tony, who'd spent decades building his empire the hard way, it was a subtle challenge, one he didn't take lightly. Tony Beets had always run his operations like a battlefield general. What he said went. No questions asked. But Parker, he wasn't built to follow orders anymore. The two men were cut from the same cloth. Stubborn, proud, and allergic to backing down. And when two bulls charge the same field, well, the dust never settles quietly. The first real crack came over a deal. Pay dirt. Tony offered Parker a batch of pay from one of his older cuts, a courtesy that once would have been seen as a favor. But Parker refused. Calm, polite, but firm. "I appreciate it, Tony," he said, "but I think I can do better on my own this season." For a man like Tony, that stung. "You think you can outmine me, kid?" he growled later in the bar at Dawson City. "Let's see how long that confidence lasts when your sluice freezes." Crew members started whispering about the tension. What used to be friendly competition now felt like a rivalry. Parker's crew stopped dropping by Tony's camp for spare parts or advice. Tony stopped sending his mechanic over when Parker's hoses burst. Even the production crew noticed the banter had turned to cold silence. Then came the argument over boundaries. Both men were mining along the same creek system, and Tony swore Parker's new trench was cutting too close to his claim line. Parker's surveyor showed the legal paperwork, but Tony wasn't having it. "I've been mining this ground before you even learned how to drive," he barked. "You stay on your side, I'll stay on mine." From that moment on, something changed in the air. You could feel it, like static before a storm. That season, the Yukon wasn't big enough for both of them anymore. Wherever Parker moved his gear, Tony's crew seemed to glare from across the valley. It was like watching a game of chess in real life. Each man making quiet, strategic moves, pretending it wasn't personal, but everyone knew it was. Tony's daughter Monica later admitted, "Dad respected Parker, but he didn't like being outshined." And truth be told, Parker didn't want to be in anyone's shadow. The cracks between them deepened as the months rolled on. Even their crews started to divide. The old hands loyal to Tony's hard-nosed ways versus the younger guys who believed in Parker's modern methods. The Yukon had always been a harsh teacher, but now it was turning into a battlefield of pride. When the next thaw came, both men were ready for another season, but this time they weren't working together. Tony would double down on his dredge, determined to prove the kid still had a lot to learn. Parker, on the other hand, was on a mission to prove he didn't need anyone's help. And while neither man said it out loud, everyone in the valley knew it. The friendship that once struck gold was cracking under the weight of ambition. It wasn't open war yet, but it was coming. Because out here in the Yukon, when pride meets pressure, something's bound to break. When the Yukon thawed that spring, it didn't just melt the snow, it thawed a rivalry that had been simmering for months. The gold fields that once echoed with laughter and roaring machinery now carried something colder: silence and suspicion. Tony Beets and Parker Schnabel, two names once spoken side by side with respect, were now whispered in separate camps. Their partnership, built on mud, sweat, and years of shared ambition, had finally split down the middle. At first, nobody believed it. How could two of the biggest miners on the show, mentor and protege, fall out so fast? But those who worked closest to them saw it coming like a slow-moving landslide. One disagreement after another, one deal gone sour, until there was nothing left but pride and pay dirt between them. That summer, Tony made a bold move. He doubled down on his own operations, expanding dredge cuts and staking new ground along the creek Parker once helped him explore. Some called it business, others called it revenge. Meanwhile, Parker fired up his wash plants and vowed to beat Tony's gold count, ounce for ounce, week after week. "This season," Parker told his crew, "we mine smarter, faster, and cleaner. No shortcuts, no help." For the first time, the student was going head-to-head with the teacher. But as their rivalry grew, so did the tension. Rumors began swirling across the camps. Tony accused Parker of encroaching near his boundaries again, while Parker's crew claimed Tony was trying to sabotage their supply runs by blocking off access roads. Neither accusation was proven. But out here, in the Yukon's isolation, rumors are as dangerous as bullets. Then came the big one. The equipment deal gone wrong. Tony had been leasing one of his old dredge pumps to Parker. When Parker's crew claimed the pump failed and demanded a replacement, Tony fired back with an invoice that could make a banker faint. "If you break it, you buy it." Tony barked on camera, his face red with fury. "That pump was older than my grandpa," Parker shot back. "You knew it was junk when you sent it. It wasn't just business anymore, it was personal." The fallout was messy, public, and impossible to ignore. Fans started noticing the tension in every scene. The easy banter was gone. The handshakes replaced with curt nods and cold stares. What had started as a friendly rivalry was now a full-blown feud, one that played out on TV for millions to see. Even the Discovery crew struggled to keep the peace. Producers tried to bring them together for a joint cleanup episode, but neither side would budge. Tony's camp said Parker had forgotten his place. Parker's crew called Tony a relic of the old guard. And just like that, the Yukon goldfields became the stage for one of the most dramatic showdowns in gold rush history. There was no winner that season. Not really. Tony's dredge broke down mid-run, costing him weeks of downtime. Parker hit gold, but fell short of his record. Both men walked away, frustrated, exhausted, and determined to never rely on the other again. When the season ended, Tony didn't show up at Parker's celebration. Parker didn't mention Tony in his thank yous. The brotherhood that once inspired millions of viewers was officially over. But deep down, both men knew it wasn't just about gold anymore. It was about legacy. Tony had spent decades carving his name into the Yukon's frozen soil. Parker was just getting started, and he wasn't planning on stopping. And as the cameras packed up and the snow began to fall once more, one thing became clear. The real treasure wasn't the gold in the ground. It was the power to outlast the other man. The Beets versus Schnabel feud had just gone from friendly competition to open war. But what happened next? What pushed Tony Beets over the edge? And how did Parker's next move nearly get Tony banned from mining altogether? By the time the next season rolled around, the Yukon wasn't just frozen, it was fractured. The once booming friendship between Parker Schnabel and Tony Beets had turned into a cold, silent war. And the tension didn't just hang in the air. It echoed through every rumbling engine and every shovel of pay dirt. Tony Beets was still the king of the Klondike, but his empire was starting to show cracks. His dredge, once the pride of his operation, had become a burden. Expensive to maintain, slow to move, and constantly breaking down. The ground he'd worked for decades was drying up, and the gold yields weren't what they used to be. But Tony wasn't the kind of man to give up. He'd mined through worse, and he sure as hell wasn't about to let Parker outshine him now. Meanwhile, Parker was evolving. While Tony fought with the past, Parker was building the future. Newer equipment, smarter technology, and tighter operations. He'd learned every trick Tony ever taught him, then found ways to do it faster, cheaper, and better. And that's when Parker made the move. It started quietly. Parker began negotiating with local claim owners, ground that Tony had been eyeing for years. Nobody thought much of it until the paperwork came through, and suddenly Parker Schnabel had locked down rights to one of the richest stretches of ground in the region, just a few miles downstream from Tony's main cut. The kicker? Tony had been in talks to buy that same ground just months earlier. When the news hit, Tony exploded. "That kid went behind my back," he roared, slamming his fist on the dredge office table. "He knew I wanted that land, and he undercut me." But Parker saw it differently. "Business is business," he told his crew. "Tony taught me that himself." It was ruthless. It was brilliant. It was exactly the kind of move that made Parker Schnabel a legend. But the fallout was immediate. Tony's operation took a hit. Without access to that new ground, he was forced to work a depleted section of his old claim. Gold returns dropped, maintenance costs skyrocketed, and frustration boiled over. Crew members started quitting, equipment sat idle, and tensions ran high. Then came the worst blow of all, a regulatory inspection. Local authorities flagged Tony's operation for environmental violations, a result of a tailings pond that had overflowed into a nearby creek. Tony insisted it was a mistake, that spring runoff had caused the overflow, not negligence. But the officials didn't buy it. They fined him heavily and issued a temporary suspension on his mining permit. It was the nightmare headline no miner ever wants to see. Tony Beets banned from mining, pending investigation. For a man like Tony, it wasn't just a setback, it was humiliation. The cameras caught him pacing outside his camp, his voice low but full of fire. They want to take my mine over paperwork after all these damn years. Behind the scenes, rumors swirled that Parker's camp had quietly tipped off inspectors, that his team's satellite data and drone surveys might have revealed the environmental breach. Nothing was ever proven, but the timing was suspicious. The Yukon mining world was divided. Some said Parker had finally gone too far. Others said he simply played the game smarter. But one thing was certain. The student had outmaneuvered the teacher. For Tony, it was the lowest point in decades. His dredge sat silent, his crew scattered, and the cold northern wind seemed to whisper the one truth he didn't want to face. Maybe his reign was finally over. But if there's one thing everyone knows about Tony Beets, it's this. You can bury him in snow, but you'll never keep him down. As Parker celebrated another record-breaking cleanup, Tony was already planning his comeback, one that would shock everyone, even Parker himself. Because in the Yukon, gold isn't the only thing that glitters, so does revenge. The Yukon has a way of humbling even its toughest miners. And for Tony Beets, the so-called king of the Klondike, this was his reckoning. After the headlines screamed that Tony had been banned from mining, the whole region buzzed with rumors. Some said he'd broken environmental laws. Others swore Parker had turned him in. The truth, though, like the gold buried deep in the permafrost, was far more complicated. Tony's tailings pond incident was real, but not the scandal everyone imagined. A late-season thaw had caused runoff from his settling pond to breach a natural embankment, sending silt into the creek below. It wasn't deliberate, it was bad timing, bad luck, and a brutal Yukon spring. But bureaucracy doesn't care about bad luck. Overnight, Tony's permits were suspended. His machines went quiet. His crew stood down. For weeks, Tony fought the ruling. He hired lawyers, filed appeals, and went toe-to-toe with environmental regulators. But behind the scenes, something even more explosive was happening. Discovery's production team was whispering that Parker's tech consultants, the same team that used drones and AI mapping, had reported the soil breach first. If true, it meant Parker might have indirectly triggered the inspection that brought Tony's empire to its knees. When word reached Tony, he didn't hold back. "After everything I taught that kid," he growled in an off-camera moment, "he pays me back by snitching to the government?" But Parker denied it. Calm, composed, almost too calm. "I didn't turn Tony in," he told producers. "We just found something unusual on our drone footage." It wasn't personal. It was data. Yet for Tony, it was always personal. As the weeks turned to months, the old miner refused to go quietly. He rebuilt the embankment, corrected the drainage, and brought in consultants of his own to prove his innocence. Slowly, the ban was lifted, but the damage was done. His reputation had taken a hit, sponsors backed out, and his once mighty camp now looked like a ghost town. Meanwhile, Parker's operation was thriving. His new ground was producing more gold than ever, his equipment gleaming under the Yukon sun. He had outsmarted, outmined, and outlasted the man who once showed him how to dig. But victory came with a strange silence, because no matter how much gold Parker pulled from the dirt, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost, something more valuable than any ounce of pay dirt. In the season finale interview, Parker admitted, "Tony's the reason I learned to fight for what I want. But sometimes, fighting for what you want means losing who you were." Tony, on the other hand, leaned into the storm. Standing before his repaired dredge, face weathered by decades of Yukon wind, he looked straight into the camera and, "They tried to shut me down. But I'm still here, and as long as there's gold in this ground, I'll dig until the last breath I take." It was raw, defiant, unforgettable. By the season's end, viewers were divided. Was Parker a visionary or a backstabber? Was Tony reckless or just old school? The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the middle. Two men, two legends, one goldfield, forever changed. But just when fans thought the feud was over, a final teaser shook everything. Footage of Tony's crew unearthing something deep in the reclaimed pit, something metallic, ancient-looking, and definitely not gold. The screen faded to black. Narrator voiceover: "Next season, Tony Beets returns to the Yukon, but what he finds buried beneath his old claim will change everything."